On the far edges of the galaxy, a lone human explorer drifted through the quiet vastness of space. He was stationed on a small research station, barely more than a floating outpost, perched on the outer rim of a star system rarely charted by most of the galaxy. His days were filled with data analysis, scanning distant planets, and cataloging the stars. But today was different. Today, the universe was going to throw something unexpected his way. The human, who had spent months alone, was piloting his small scout ship when he spotted a strange anomaly on his ship's radar. It appeared to be an unregistered signal, something far too unusual for him to ignore. He brought his ship closer to investigate, his curiosity pushing him to explore this mysterious find. The source of the signal seemed to come from a nearby planet, a small green world covered with thick forests and strange landscapes. He didn't expect much. After all, most signals out here were either debris or abandoned tech. But as he descended through the atmosphere and broke through the thick clouds, something caught his eye. There, in the middle of a dense forest, was the wreckage of a ship. It was unlike anything the human had ever seen, large and broken apart, as if it had crashed. Pieces of strange metal and glowing fragments scattered across the ground, half buried in the dirt. The human landed his ship nearby and took a deep breath. He wasn't exactly trained for rescue operations, but something about this seemed urgent. He grabbed his emergency gear, equipped with a basic medkit, and set out toward the wreckage. The forest was eerily quiet, save for the sound of his boots crunching through the underbrush. As he neared the wreck, he saw the remnants of what must have been an alien vessel, with strange symbols etched into its hull. His heart raced, both in excitement and a growing sense of unease. Then, from the twisted metal, a low, weak sound reached his ears. He froze. It was faint, but unmistakable. A groan, followed by a soft cry. Someone, or something, was still alive. The human hurried forward, his pulse quickening. Behind the wreckage, hidden beneath some debris, lay an injured figure. It was small, fragile, and covered in what appeared to be blue, shimmering skin. As he got closer, he realized it was a girl, an alien girl. Her body was covered in cuts and bruises, and she was breathing shallowly, barely conscious. Her small chest rose and fell in a weak rhythm, and her hands trembled. Without thinking, the human rushed to her side. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. She was like no alien he had encountered before. Her features were delicate, with large, luminous eyes that fluttered open weakly as she looked up at him. She seemed confused, frightened, but not entirely aware of what was happening around her. "Hey, it's okay," he said softly, kneeling beside her and gently lifting her head. His voice was calm, though his heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure if she could understand him, but he hoped his tone would bring her some comfort. He reached into his medkit and pulled out a basic stimulator. Carefully, he injected it into her arm. The girl flinched but didn't resist. Slowly, her breathing steadied, and her wide eyes blinked up at him in surprise. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The human, now realizing the urgency of the situation, looked around. The wreckage was scattered everywhere, and he had no idea how far the damage extended. He needed to get her out of here fast. There could be other dangers lurking in the forest, wild creatures, or even other hostile forces. He lifted the girl into his arms, surprisingly light despite her alien nature. Her skin felt warm to the touch, almost radiating heat, as if she were from a place much hotter than this planet. The human wasn't sure what to think, but he couldn't leave her here. Whatever had happened to her, he had to help. With the girl secured in his arms, the human made his way back to the ship, careful to avoid the worst of the wreckage. He reached the ship's door, the auto-lock clicking open as he stepped inside. The air inside the small scout ship was cool and sterile, a sharp contrast to the humid forest outside. He laid the girl down gently on the medical table, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted her position. He quickly set the ship's system to run diagnostics, trying to assess her condition while he gathered more supplies. The girl remained silent, her large eyes watching him with a mix of confusion and trust. He wondered what had brought her here, what kind of creature she was. The wreckage of her ship looked almost too advanced, too foreign for this planet. And yet here she was, lying in front of him, an alien who had crashed onto this forgotten world. The human could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He didn't know who she was, or where she came from, but he had made a choice. He couldn't leave her to die alone in the wilderness. As the ship's diagnostic finished, the human knew he had a lot of questions, and very few answers. He looked down at the girl, her eyes now half closed in a state of exhaustion. He promised himself that he would find the answers, but for now, all he could do was protect her and hope that somehow this unexpected encounter wouldn't lead them both into even greater danger. But something deep inside him felt that this was just the beginning of an even larger story, a story that would stretch across the stars. The days that followed the crash were filled with questions, but also a strange sense of peace. The human had never imagined he would find an injured alien on a forgotten world, but now that she was here, he couldn't help but feel a strange attachment. As the girl healed, something deeper began to form between them, a bond that neither of them had expected. The alien girl, still weak from the crash and her injuries, slowly began to regain her strength. She was quiet, often lying on the medical table, her large eyes watching him as he moved around the ship. There was a mystery about her, an air of sadness mixed with confusion. She never spoke much, but there was an intensity in her gaze, as if she was trying to understand who he was and why he had helped her. The human tried to communicate with her. At first, he wasn't sure if she could understand him, but he quickly realized that her intelligence was beyond what he expected. She seemed to pick up on simple gestures, and slowly, with patience, they began to establish a rudimentary way to communicate. The human would point to objects, say their names, and the girl would nod or mimic the actions. She had no words, but her eyes were full of understanding. He started teaching her basic words, simple concepts like food, water, and help. The girl would repeat the words back to him, her voice soft and hesitant, but there was a spark of curiosity in her. It was as though she was soaking up the world around her, trying to piece together where she was and who she was. The human, in turn, found himself speaking to her more than he had to anyone in months. He told her about his life, about the research station, the stars he had studied, the quiet loneliness of his job. He realized he missed having someone to talk to. In the silence of space, his words had been empty echoes. But now he had an audience. The girl, though she didn't speak much, seemed to listen with rapt attention, her eyes wide and full of wonder, as if his words were a lifeline to something greater than herself. Despite the differences in their languages, there was something comforting about the shared silence. Sometimes they would sit together by the small window, looking out at the stars as the ship drifted through space. The human would glance at her, and for a brief moment, he could almost forget the strangeness of the situation. He would forget that she wasn't human, forget that she came from an entirely different world. She was just another living being, one who had needed help, and now she was here. The girl, in turn, began to show subtle signs of attachment as well. She would follow him around the ship, her small footsteps barely making the sound. When he worked, she would sit nearby, watching him closely, always alert. She would offer small gestures of affection, like touching his hand or sitting close to him, as if she was trying to understand how to show gratitude. One evening, as he prepared a meal in the ship's small galley, she brought him a small piece of glowing fruit she had found outside. It was alien in nature, but it was her way of offering something in return. The human smiled at her gesture, touched by the kindness she was learning to express. He accepted the fruit, examining it carefully before taking a bite. It was sweet with an exotic flavor he couldn't quite place. He chuckled softly, wondering if it was some sort of test. As the days passed, The girl grew stronger. Her injuries began to heal, and she started moving around the ship more freely. Her movements were graceful, almost otherworldly, and the human couldn't help but marvel at how effortlessly she seemed to navigate her surroundings, despite the foreign nature of everything around her. One evening, after a long day of teaching her more words, the girl finally spoke. It was only one word, and her voice was soft, but it was the first time she had spoken since the crash. The human froze. The word was clear, but the way she said it, there was so much weight in that single syllable. She had spoken it with a mixture of longing and sorrow, as if she were homesick. He looked at her, not knowing how to respond. The girl's eyes were filled with emotion, but she didn't say more. Instead, she turned away, gazing out the window at the stars. The human knew, then, that she wasn't just lost. She wasn't just some random traveler who had stumbled onto his ship. She had a past, a history, a home somewhere in the stars, and wherever that home was, it was now far beyond her reach. The girl had been taken from her world, and he had no idea how to help her find her way back. But one thing was clear: he had become a part of her story. Whether he wanted to be or not, he had entered her life, and she had entered his. He had saved her, and in return, she had begun to fill the emptiness that had been with him for so long. He couldn't just send her away. He couldn't leave her to face the unknown alone. The human promised himself, as he looked at the girl, that he would find a way to help her. He didn't know how or where he would start, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to let her be alone again. For the first time since the crash, he felt a sense of purpose. His mission wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protecting this girl, this alien being, who had somehow become his responsibility. And though he didn't know what the future held, he knew that they would face it together. The days that followed felt like a strange blur to the human. He was no longer alone, and though the alien girl hadn't said much more since that quiet evening, her presence filled the ship with a subtle energy. She seemed to be getting stronger, both physically and mentally. Her once fragile state had transformed into something more confident, though she still kept to herself, often gazing out the windows as if searching for something. The human didn't know what, but he could feel a growing tension in her, a quiet struggle. One morning, as the human worked on ship repairs, he heard a soft sound behind him. Turning, he saw the girl standing in the doorway of the main room. She hadn't moved from the medical bay in days, and now she was up, standing tall, her face expressionless. "Are you okay?" he asked, concerned. The girl didn't answer, but there was something different in her posture. It was as though she was no longer the fragile, injured being he had rescued, but someone who had regained their strength, someone more powerful. He stepped closer to her, feeling an odd sense of unease. "You're okay now, right?" Before he could reach her, something happened. The girl raised one hand, and a soft blue glow surrounded her fingers. The light pulsed slowly, like the rhythm of a heartbeat. The human froze. The glow didn't seem to come from anything, and yet it felt so real, so vivid. He stepped back in surprise. What is that?" he whispered, his voice shaking slightly. The girl's eyes were wide, her expression blank, but there was a certain intensity in her gaze. The glow around her hand flared brighter for a moment, then faded just as quickly. She didn't speak, but the human could see her hand twitch as if unsure of what had just happened. It was as if she herself didn't understand it. He didn't know what to make of it. In all his years of exploration, he had never seen anything like this. Could it be some kind of technology? A strange biological ability? He wasn't sure, but one thing was clear. This girl was unlike any being he had ever encountered. "Can you show me again?" he asked cautiously, his voice filled with both curiosity and fear. The girl looked at him, and for a moment, he thought she might walk away. But then she raised her hand once more. The glow returned, stronger this time. The room seemed to hum with the energy, the very air around them growing warmer. The human could feel the hair on his arms stand on end as the light flickered and danced in the girl's hand. She was concentrating now, her brows furrowed slightly, as if she were learning to control the strange power that flowed through her. The human took a cautious step forward. "That's amazing. But how are you doing it? What is it?" The girl didn't answer. Instead, she closed her hand into a fist, and the light vanished instantly. She blinked, looking at her hand as if in surprise. Then she glanced at the human, her expression still unreadable. The human took a deep breath. This wasn't just a random display of strange abilities. It was something real. This girl, this alien being, had powers that defied the natural laws he understood. And it was clear she didn't fully comprehend them herself. He turned away, trying to process what had just happened. He had read stories of strange beings in far-off galaxies who had abilities far beyond what humans could imagine. But seeing it with his own eyes was something else entirely. He had witnessed some of the most advanced technology the galaxy had to offer. But this was different. This was raw, untamed power. The human knew there was more to this girl than he had imagined. She wasn't just some innocent creature lost and in need of help. She was something else entirely, a being of great potential, a being that had powers that could change the course of history. And yet here she was, stranded on a distant world, with no memory of her past and no idea how to control her abilities. Over the next few days, the human tried to learn more about her powers. He would ask her to demonstrate, but she was always hesitant, unsure of herself. At times, she seemed to be afraid of what she could do. Other times, she was curious, almost as if she wanted to understand the limits of her abilities. One evening, as they sat together in the main room of the ship, the girl stared at the small cup of water in her hands. She had been quiet for a long time, and the human thought she might be lost in thought. Then, without warning, she held the cup up to her face and closed her eyes. The water began to shimmer, glowing faintly. The human watched, wide-eyed, as the water seemed to hover in midair, swirling around her fingers. "Is that?" The human's voice caught in his throat. The girl opened her eyes slowly, the water dropping back into the cup. She didn't speak, but her expression softened, as if she were finally beginning to understand something about herself. She had never been taught how to use her powers, and yet they seemed to be a natural extension of her being. For the first time, the human realized that he wasn't just taking care of a helpless alien girl anymore. He was protecting someone who might one day be able to change the fate of entire galaxies. The weight of that realization sank in slowly. He had no idea where this journey would lead, but he knew one thing for certain. The stakes were much higher than he had ever imagined. And as the girl looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet intensity, he understood that she, too, was starting to understand the true potential of what she could do. Whether she wanted it or not, she was a force to be reckoned with. The human had only begun to grasp the true depth of the girl's powers when the first ship appeared on the edge of the planet's atmosphere. It was small at first, just a dot in the sky, but it grew larger by the day, circling the planet in an unnervingly methodical pattern. The human wasn't sure what to make of it, but he had a gut feeling that it wasn't a good sign. He had been spending more time helping the girl, teaching her how to control her abilities, when the ship first appeared. At first, he thought it might just be a passing explorer or a harmless satellite. But after a few more days of watching, he realized the ship wasn't leaving. It was too purposeful, too deliberate. Something, or someone, was searching for them. The girl, meanwhile, seemed to sense the change in the air. Whenever the ship passed overhead, she would grow uneasy, her eyes darting to the sky. Her powers had been unpredictable, at best, but now it seemed as though something about the ship triggered an instinctual reaction in her. She would often retreat to the back of the ship, her hands trembling as she stared at the stars. The human noticed the fear in her eyes, but when he asked her what was wrong, she never said a word. One evening, as the human went outside to collect more supplies, he noticed a strange, faint hum filling the air. He froze. It wasn't just the ship anymore. There were more of them. 3 ships, low in the sky, silently patrolling the edge of the atmosphere. They were too fast to be ordinary civilian ships, and their sleek, black shapes gave off a menacing aura. He rushed back to the ship, panic rising in his chest. The girl was sitting by the window, staring out at the ships. She didn't look surprised, but there was a deep sadness in her gaze, as if she had known this day would come. The human rushed to her side. "Do you know who they are?" he asked, his voice tight with worry. The girl looked at him for a moment, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and resignation. Then she nodded slowly. They're looking for me." The words hit him like a punch. "Looking for you," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "Why?" The girl closed her eyes, as if gathering her strength to speak. I was running from them. They are the ones who want me back." The human was still trying to process the shock of her words. Why would they want you back? What did they want with you? She hesitated, but then, after a long pause, she spoke. "I'm not just anyone. I am from a place far from here. My people, they were once rulers of many worlds. But that changed. A war. A rebellion. I fled. They want to find me because I am the last of my kind. They think that if they capture me, they can regain their lost power." The human's heart sank. He had known there was something about the girl that didn't fit the image of an innocent child stranded on a strange planet. But he hadn't expected this. She wasn't just a survivor of some accident. She was a target. And now those who were after her had found them. He stood up, pacing back and forth. He hadn't expected this, hadn't been prepared for it. He had assumed he was just helping a lost alien, but this was something far more complicated and dangerous. The girl was right. If they caught her, they wouldn't just take her away. They would destroy everything she stood for. They would change the balance of power in the galaxy. The human turned to her. "We need to leave. Now. Before they get any closer." But the girl didn't seem to move. Her eyes were distant, almost as though she was lost in thought. "No," she said softly. "It's too late. They will find me, no matter where we go." "Then we fight," the human said firmly. "I won't let them take you." She shook her head, her expression full of sorrow. "You don't understand. They are too powerful. I am not ready. My powers, they are still growing, but I can't control them yet. And if I use them, it will only bring more of them." The human felt his stomach tighten with dread. They had been running out of time ever since the first ship arrived, and now they were trapped. But something in the girl's voice stopped him from pushing further. She wasn't just scared, she was resigned, as though she had been running for so long that the idea of being caught didn't seem so terrifying anymore. "Please," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. "You can't help me. Not now. You're too human. You can't fight them. They will destroy everything." The human stood frozen, staring at her. The girl had been through so much. She had already been running, hiding, fighting a battle he couldn't even begin to understand. He had wanted to protect her, but now he saw the reality of the situation. There were forces out there that were beyond both of them, and they were coming for her. The hum in the air grew louder. The ships were getting closer. They had found them. With a heavy heart, the human knew there was only one choice left: to protect her at all costs. Even if it meant confronting an enemy that seemed too powerful to defeat, he couldn't let her face it alone. "You're not alone," the human said quietly, his voice filled with determination. "I don't know who they are, but I'm not letting them take you." The girl met his gaze, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but also a spark of something else. Perhaps hope, perhaps trust. It wasn't much, but it was enough for the human to know that together, they might just have a chance. The human paced back and forth inside the ship, his mind racing. The enemy was closing in, and every second counted. He had no idea how to fight the ships that were circling the planet, but one thing was clear: he couldn't just sit and wait for them to find them. The girl was too important to let them capture, and now it was up to him to figure out a way to stop them. "We need to move quickly," he said, turning to the girl, who was standing by the window, her eyes locked on the ships. She had been quiet ever since their conversation, her expression still filled with uncertainty. I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The human sighed. She was scared, and who could blame her? The ships hovering in the atmosphere were only a sign of what was to come. Whoever they were after her, and they wouldn't stop until they had her. The girl had said it herself. She wasn't just some innocent being. She was the last of her kind, a powerful figure from a distant world, and they wanted her back. The human had no idea how to fight something like that. He had no weapons, no military training. He was just a man with basic knowledge of survival in the stars, but nothing prepared him for this. He wasn't equipped to face an enemy who could command entire fleets of ships, but there was one thing he could do. He could protect the girl. He wouldn't let her fall into their hands. The girl seemed to sense his resolve. She turned toward him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude. "You're willing to fight for me?" she asked softly. The human nodded. "I have to. You're not alone anymore. We'll figure this out together." The girl hesitated, her face full of doubt. "But I'm not ready. My powers, they're still unstable. If I use them, I could hurt you. I could hurt everything." "Unwilling to take that risk," he said, his voice firm. "We don't have time to think about what might go wrong. We have to act now." She looked at him, her eyes softening. For the first time, there was a glimmer of trust in her gaze. She was still afraid, but she was no longer as alone as she had been before. The human had made up his mind, and he would do whatever it took to help her, even if it meant standing against the unknown. They rushed to the control room of the ship, where the human began typing rapidly on the console. The girl stood behind him, watching silently. The human had an idea. He didn't know if it would work, but it was their best chance. "I can try to disrupt their communications," he muttered to himself. "Maybe that will slow them down. If they lose contact with each other, they won't be able to coordinate their attack." The girl's eyes widened. "You think you can do that?" "I have to try." He worked quickly, scanning the systems, trying to figure out how to send a signal that would block the enemy ship's communications. It wasn't easy, and he wasn't sure if it would even work, but he had no other options. As he worked, the girl stood by him, her hands clenched at her sides. "I'll help you," she said, her voice steady now. The human glanced up at her, surprised. "How?" "I can sense their technology," she said. "I can feel their ships. I don't know how, but it's like I can touch them with my mind. I'll guide you." The human stared at her, amazed. This was the first time she had spoken so confidently. Maybe she wasn't as helpless as she had seemed. He nodded quickly, giving her a slight smile. "Okay, let's do it." They worked together in silence. The human focused on the control panel, trying to line up the signal blockers, while the girl concentrated, her eyes closed as she reached out with her mind. He could see her hands trembling slightly, but her determination was stronger than her fear. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the soft hum of the ship's systems. The tension was unbearable, each passing second feeling like an eternity. He could almost feel the enemy ships above them, closing in, growing closer by the minute. They had no more time. "Almost there," the human muttered, his hands flying over the keys. The girl's face was pale, and her breathing was shallow, but she didn't look away from the console. She was doing her part, reaching out with her power to guide the signal. Finally, with one last press of a button, the human hit the final command. The ship's systems hummed loudly, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then the control panel flashed, and a strange, vibrating hum filled the air. "Did it work?" the girl asked, her voice shaking. The human waited, his heart pounding. He opened the sensor controls and saw a new display on the screen. The enemy ships had stopped moving. They were still hovering, but they weren't communicating with each other anymore. Their movements were erratic, confused. It worked, the human said, his voice filled with relief. But it wasn't over yet. They had bought themselves some time, but the enemy wasn't going to give up. They would regroup and try again. And next time, they might be ready. The human turned to the girl. Now we need to leave. We can't stay here. They'll be back soon, and we have to find a place where we can hide. She nodded, her eyes still filled with worry. But for the first time, there was hope in her expression as well. They had won a small victory, and it was enough to remind them both that they weren't powerless. Together, they had a chance. "Let's go," the human said, determination in his voice. "We'll keep moving. We'll stay ahead of them." And so they prepared to leave the planet behind, knowing that the real battle was only just beginning. The human wasn't sure what awaited them next, but he was ready. Whatever it took, he would fight to keep her safe. The stars outside the ship stretched into streaks of light as they traveled at high speed, leaving the planet behind. The human and the girl were now in the deep void of space, trying to stay ahead of the ships that had once seemed like an ominous shadow, but now felt all too real. Despite their brief victory in jamming their communications, the human knew they were far from safe. The ships would eventually regain their coordination, and when they did, the hunt would continue. As the human worked on recalibrating the ship's navigation systems, the girl sat quietly at the window, staring out into the vastness of space. Her eyes were full of worry, but also something else, something darker. The human had begun to notice it more in the past few days. She was not just afraid of what was coming. She seemed to carry the weight of something deeper, something from her past that she wasn't ready to speak about. The human didn't want to push her, but the silence between them was becoming uncomfortable. He could feel the weight of her unspoken thoughts, and he didn't know how to help her. Instead, he focused on the task at hand, keeping the ship moving, staying one step ahead of their pursuers. "We're going to need to make some serious repairs soon," he said, breaking the silence. "We've been pushing this old ship too hard. The engines are barely holding up." The girl didn't respond. She just nodded faintly, her eyes still fixed on the stars. "I'll need your help when we get to the next station," he continued, trying to keep the mood light. "If we don't find some parts soon, we might be stuck drifting." At that, the girl turned her head slightly, her gaze meeting his for the first time in hours. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice soft but sharp with curiosity. The human paused. He hadn't really thought about where they were heading. All he knew was that they needed to put as much distance between themselves and the ships as possible. He didn't want to head to any major space stations. That would only put them at risk. But they couldn't keep running forever. "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess we'll just have to figure it out as we go. Maybe there's a remote station or a hidden outpost somewhere. A place where we can repair the ship and lay low for a while." The girl seemed to consider this, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked back out into the void. "You're running blind," she said quietly. "They will catch us eventually. You don't know where we can go." The human's heart sank at her words. He had known that he didn't have all the answers, but hearing her say it out loud made it feel real. They were in uncharted space, and their options were growing slim. "We're not completely blind," he replied, his voice firmer than he felt. "I've navigated worse places. We just need to keep moving, stay ahead of them." She turned to look at him now, her eyes reflecting something like doubt. "You don't understand, do you? It's not just the ships you need to worry about." The human's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" The girl took a deep breath, and for a moment, the human thought she might not say anything more. But then she spoke, her words slow, measured. "There are people, others who work for them. They're not just in ships. They're everywhere. Their reach is vast, and they know how to track me. They know more than I told you." The human felt a chill run down his spine. "You mean there's more than just those ships?" She nodded. "Much more. They'd been searching for me for a long time. I don't know how they've done it, but they've managed to track my energy, my presence, wherever I go." The human's mind raced. How was that even possible? Could they be tracking the ship's power signature? No, that wouldn't explain it. The girl's powers. Was it possible that she was unknowingly leaving some kind of trace that led them directly to her? "What are we dealing with here?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "How can they track you?" She hesitated, her face pale. "It's not just a simple trace. They've developed something far more advanced than anything I've ever seen. It's like a resonance, a signal that connects me to them. Every time I use my powers, every time I try to hide, I leave a mark. They can follow that mark." The human didn't know what to say. The girl had powers beyond anything he could imagine, and yet they weren't enough to protect her. They were connected to her in some way, something that even she didn't fully understand. How could he fight something like that? "So what are we supposed to do now?" the human asked, his voice strained with the weight of it all. "How do we hide from something like that?" The girl looked out the window again, her gaze distant. "I don't know, but I do know this. The longer we stay on the run, the more dangerous it will get. They'll eventually find us, no matter how far we go. But there is one place I can think of, that might give us a chance to hide." The human's eyes widened. "Where?" "On the edge of the known galaxy," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "There's a planet, forgotten by most, hidden away from the reach of anyone who might come looking for us. It's far enough that they won't be able to track us there, but we would have to move quickly." The human's heart skipped a beat. He had heard stories about such places, hidden worlds, off limits to most, left alone for centuries. But could it be real? And could it be their salvation? Without another word, the girl began to plot a course on the ship's navigation system, her fingers moving quickly over the controls. The human watched her, a sense of urgency building in his chest. They had no choice now. If they were going to survive, they had to reach this hidden world. It was their only hope. As the ship's engines roared to life once again, the human felt a surge of both fear and determination. The galaxy was vast, and dangers lurked everywhere. But for the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't alone. Together, they would face whatever came next, and they would do whatever it took to survive. The ship surged forward through the endless void of space, the stars blurring into streaks of light. The human sat in the control seat, his hands gripping the console as he kept his eyes fixed on the navigation system. The girl was beside him, staring out at the stars, her face unreadable. For a while, there had been silence between them, broken only by the low hum of the engines. They had set course for the hidden planet, but there was no certainty that they would make it in time. The enemy ships were still out there, somewhere, waiting for them to slip up. "We're getting closer," the human muttered, glancing at the scanner. "But we're not there yet." The girl nodded, but didn't respond. She seemed lost in her own thoughts, her mind far away from the ship, from the hunt that was closing in on them. The human had noticed the change in her over the past few days. She was becoming distant, almost as if she were already preparing for something terrible. He didn't like it, but he knew there was nothing he could say to change her mind. She had seen too much, lost too much. She was a survivor, but in a way, she had already given up. The human's heart ached for her, but he couldn't let that stop him. They had to survive. They had to reach the hidden planet. It was their only hope now. The engines hummed again, a warning this time. The human frowned and checked the system. "There's something wrong with the power converter," he said, frustration creeping into his voice. "We need to fix it, or we won't have enough fuel to reach the planet." The girl finally turned her head, her expression cold. "You can't fix it. You'll never make it in time." The human looked at her, stunned. "What do you mean?" "I can fix it. I know how to repair it." She shook her head, her eyes filled with sadness. "It's not enough. You don't have the time or the tools to make the repairs. And even if you do, they'll still find us. They'll always find us." Her words hit him like a blow. He had been hoping for a miracle, but her certainty made him realize just how close they were to losing, how much of a gamble their plan had been. They were running out of options, and even if they made it to the hidden planet, it might not be enough to escape the enemies that were tracking them. He stood up from the control chair, pacing back and forth, trying to think of a solution, but nothing came to mind. There were no more tricks, no more hiding places. He had done everything he could, and still, they were at the mercy of forces beyond their control. "I'm sorry," the girl said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "I didn't want this to happen. I didn't want to drag you into this, but it's too late now." "Stop," the human said, his voice breaking through the haze of defeat. "You didn't drag me into anything. I chose this. I chose to help you, and I'll keep helping you, no matter what happens." She didn't say anything in response. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive. The human could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. They had come so far, but now it seemed like the end was inevitable. He couldn't protect her from everything, and that was the hardest truth he had to accept. Just as he was about to turn back to the controls, a new warning flashed on the screen. The human's heart skipped a beat. "Incoming ships," he said, his voice filled with dread. The girl's face went pale, but she didn't look surprised. "It's them. They found us." The human's mind raced. He was too far from any safe harbor, and their ship was barely functioning. There was no way they could fight them off, not without the right equipment, not without a miracle. He turned to the girl. "We can't outrun them, but maybe we can hide. There must be something, some place where they can't find us." Her eyes locked with his. "There is one place, but it's a last resort. If we go there, we won't come back." The human's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "There's a system," she said slowly. "A place that no one knows about. It's hidden, outside of normal space. I can take us there, but once we enter, we can never leave. It's a prison of sorts. A place where time doesn't pass the same way. A place where we could be trapped forever." The human stared at her in disbelief. A place where they could hide, but never escape. The choice was impossible. If they stayed out here, they would be caught. But if they entered this hidden place, they might be trapped forever. He looked at the girl. She was already making up her mind, already accepting the risk. Her eyes were calm, resigned. She was ready to do whatever it took to survive. "I won't make you do this alone," the human said quietly. "If this is the only way, then I'm with you. We go together." She nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. "Thank you." The human took a deep breath. He wasn't sure what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. He would fight for her. He would protect her, no matter what the cost. With a steady hand, he turned back to the controls and punched in the coordinates for the hidden system. The ship shuddered as the engines roared to life, and they slipped into the darkness of uncharted space. The stars outside began to twist, bending and warping as the ship entered the unknown. The human held his breath, gripping the controls tightly. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if they would ever be able to leave. But one thing was clear: they had made their choice, and they would face whatever came next together. The final leap into the unknown had begun.